What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an overview for the Cleric class in Baldur's Gate 3. Clerics are agents of the divine. They serve the gods very directly, who are in turn the source of their power. The setting of Baldur's Gate 3, the Forgotten Realms specifically, is host to a diverse world of gods and the spheres of influence that they control. As such, the people that serve those gods are equally diverse, which can make clerics in particular a very versatile class in how they approach various things in their pursuit of spreading the will of their deity. As such, we'll be going over general class mechanics, talking about the class fantasy of a cleric, but that said, we're not diving too deep into the math, especially since 4 of the 7 domains that we will ultimately be able to choose from as a subclass aren't available in early access ahead of launch. Though with 7 subclasses available, they will have the second most of any class 4 subclasses. From there though, let's jump right into it and talk about the class fantasy of a cleric. Clerics in D&D are more than just priests or people in service to churches of various deities. They are people who very specifically receive power directly from a god. They then use this power to essentially do whatever that god tells them to do, and because of this can be a very passive thing where a cleric's goal might simply be spreading that god's faith through their actions and deeds. Other times it might be a very much so direct communication where a god is very specifically telling a cleric to do something in particular. And that direct connection is largely what sets a cleric apart from regular priests or general religious figures. Many people worship the gods, but clerics have a direct communion with them. So in 5th edition D&D, where we have paladins and druids who have largely had their connections to deities made more ambiguous, they can be as involved or as irrelevant as you want in those cases, as opposed to previous editions where they were very much so connected to deities more directly. In 5th edition here, the only class that really directly serves gods is a cleric. However, because of all of those various things I just mentioned, how you choose to roleplay that is largely up to you, and it is pretty wide open. Though the first part of creating any cleric is deciding what deity you serve and what your relationship with that deity is. For instance, did you seek power out, or did that deity directly intervene and say, you are going to have this power because I need you to do things for me? Which may or may not be something you actually wanted to do or signed up for. However, in asking yourself those questions, you might eventually stumble upon the idea of a rather straightforward notion, which is simply, why would a god want to give people this power? And the answer to a question like that is summed up through a variety of means, though in a game like this there are certainly exceptions to every rule. But in most circumstances, gods are forbidden these days at the time of Baldur's Gate 3 from directly interfering with mortals. It used to be a very common occurrence where gods have at times even walked the world, so often they employ mortals these days to do it for them. However, as I mentioned, there are exceptions to every rule, and more often than not, gods are still able to act within their own sphere of influence, which is why we can still see them do things like manifest avatars, but most of the time they simply act indirectly through things like clerics. And that gives you even more fuel for the class fantasy portion of a cleric. In addition to the deity you serve, how you came into that service, what exactly is their agenda, what is the indirect thing they need you to do, or are you simply spreading the word of that deity? Perhaps you simply believe in the principles they espouse. So while the specifics are up to you, a cleric is nonetheless beholden to their deity, and everything they do is to ultimately fulfill that goal. But in a world like the Forgotten Realms, where we have deities like Lathander, whose reverence for life and things like renewal might have their clerics going around trying to redeem people who have done terrible things, or simply pointing anyone in general towards a new beginning, is certainly one interpretation, but we also have gods of murder like Baal, who will almost certainly be trying to get clerics to perform said murders. And while those are two extremes, there's plenty of things in between, such as Joaquin, the goddess of trade, or Ogma, the god of knowledge, who would of course have very different goals related to their sphere of influence and spreading it as far as possible. So as such, the class fantasy of a cleric is incredibly diverse, and it's ultimately going to be what you make of it, which is in no small part down to the deity you serve and the domain in which you are serving them with. So with that in mind, we're going to move on to some general class mechanics and things before we circle back to domains at the end of the video. So let's talk general information. First up, the most important ability score for a cleric is Wisdom. This is because they are ultimately full spellcasters who are granted spells from their divine deity, and all of that spellcasting runs off of Wisdom, in addition to several of their class features. So Wisdom is by far the most important. However, from there, like many classes, you have some wiggle room. If you want to be a little more melee focused, you're probably going to want something like Strength and some Constitution, but the exact makeup really just depends on what you're doing with the class. From there though, let's talk proficiencies. It's worth a mention that depending on the domain you choose, you will get some extra proficiencies on top of this, but for the base class, they come with light and medium armor proficiency, as well as simple weapons, with the mace being a particularly popular choice. From there, let's talk spellcasting a bit. As I mentioned, clerics are full divine casters. That is to say, if they were to go to level 20, they would ultimately get level 9 spells, but as the level cap in Baldur's Gate 3 is 12, they will get 6th level spells if they make it that far. However, there are a few things that make this spellcasting unique. They are prepared casters, which means they have to prepare their spells, but they don't have to worry about ever learning any of them, because when they hit the appropriate level, they will automatically learn at a base level all of the spells available to a cleric at that level. And then from that list, they'll be able to prepare so many a day based on their level and their wisdom modifier, which makes up their base form of spellcasting. And then they'll be using their spell slots to cast these, which increases with their level like everyone else's typically. However, clerics do get a little bit extra here because depending on the domain they have, they're going to get some extra spells. As they level up, they will add domain spells to their spell list, but these spells are also always prepared, meaning you don't have to prepare them in addition to your regular spells. Any domain spell is automatically available to cast at all times, provided you have the spell slots to do so. And that's incredibly important because that's how we get the specific things a cleric might want from their spell casting outside of the more general cleric spell list, which they'll get all of. So while the normal cleric spell list includes things like healing as well as a little bit of offense via things like inflict wounds or guiding bolt, if they were to say pick up the light domain, then right at level 1 they would get something like burning hands, and then at 3rd level they could even pick up scorching ray, which they would not typically get. So domains provide an extra way to diversify their spell list a little bit beyond what would normally be available. But now let's talk about some of the other class mechanics available to us, which are going to start out with Channel Divinity. Starting at 2nd level, clerics get a variety of powers based on the domain they have chosen, which will allow them to channel the divinity of their god into some sort of special power. At first you can only do this once per day, but eventually when you hit level 6 it'll go up and you'll get an extra charge of this, which will help you use it more often. Now for the most part, Channel Divinity is determined by our domain like I mentioned. However, every cleric gets the option to turn undead with this. Turn undead essentially forces undead to run away from you if they fail a wisdom save, at which point the only thing it is allowed to do is run as far away from a cleric as it is possible for it to do so. And then at level 5, that actually becomes Destroy Undead. Any undead creature that fails that saving throw and is below a certain threshold of power is just immediately destroyed. And then at 10th level, clerics pick up Divine Intervention. They can essentially call on their deity to directly intervene on their behalf. In the tabletop version, you roll a dice to see whether or not this is successful and the deity actually shows up to do anything. And then what the deity does specifically is usually up for interpretation. So how that's going to work in a video game is a little vague until we see it at launch. However, it's worth mentioning that a common suggestion here is that a deity could make use of literally any cleric spell of any level as an appropriate response to your call for aid, all the way up to something like 9th level cleric spells. But again, that's just a suggestion, and what Larian does with that is kind of wide open. Now from there, let's talk deities and domains. We talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the video, but here I want to go into a little more of mechanical detail, so to speak. Now, generally speaking, in the tabletop version of this, you would make a cleric with a divine domain that is relevant to the appropriate deity. For instance, you would take the nature domain if you were serving a nature god. You would take the knowledge domain if you were serving someone like Mistra, the goddess of magic. And then there are quite a few deities who are able to be served with a variety of domains. For instance, the life domain applies to a lot of deities, because life is a very broad concept. But generally, these two things would sort of theme together based on the god and what you want to do with that cleric. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, at least in early access, there is no such restriction, and officially in the rules of the tabletop version, each deity comes with suggested domains, though at the table you can ultimately roll this any way you want, which is a little more in line with what Baldur's Gate 3 is doing with them. As it stands, though, there's nothing preventing you of becoming the cleric of an evil deity and then picking like the life domain. Now, whether or not that ultimately gets trimmed in based on the fact that that's sort of antithetical to the way some of the deities work, or whether they simply leave it free form for the sake of role-playing, remains to be seen, but given how they generally want people to be able to do the things they want without restricting them unnecessarily, I don't think this is something they're likely to change, but nonetheless something to keep in mind for sure. So as it stands, regardless of the deity you're worshipping in Baldur's Gate 3, we will have access to the 7 domains that are available in the player's handbook for 5th edition D&D. There are many more domains than this, but nonetheless, the ones we will have access to are knowledge, life, light, nature, tempest, trickery, and war. 3 of these are currently in the game right now via early access, and the other 4 will be available on launch. Right now, we have access to life, light, and trickery, though as you might imagine, all of these do something unique for your character. However, much like a wizard subclasses, most of them follow a general template, which I'm going to explain now as a sort of broad overview. So right away, when you pick up a domain at level 1, you'll get access to a few bonus features that are specific to an individual domain. For instance, the life domain picks up proficiency with heavy armor right at level 1. The light domain gets access to the light cantrip for free. The Tempest and War domains both give you access to heavy armor proficiency and martial weapons, alongside a few other things. Knowledge, for instance, gives you some proficiency with a few different skills. But in addition to those bonus effects, we also get the spells associated with each domain that will be automatically added and always prepared to our spell list for us to cast appropriately. After those things, however, at 1st, 6th, and 8th level, we will gain some sort of class mechanic. Typically, these are unique, however, sometimes they are just extra channel divinity features, though every domain gets an extra channel divinity feature at level 2 as well. All of this, naturally, is themed towards the domain you have chosen, with channel divinity in particular really reflecting that. For instance, the trickery domain will allow you to throw up an illusory distraction of sorts that can keep enemies from attacking you, though this does require concentration. However, compared to the Tempest domain's channel divinity ability of simply maximizing any lightning or thunder damage you happen to do, you can see that some of these might benefit a particular character more than others. Now, for our class features at 1st, 6th, and 8th level, these tend to be more specific. For instance, a trickery domain cleric will be able to grant people advantage on dexterity stealth throws, meaning they'll have an easier time hiding from people, whereas at 6th level they pick up an extra channel divinity that allows them to become invisible for a turn, whereas at 8th level they can add some poison damage to their attacks once per turn. So as you can see, pretty much every domain has something that leans into what they're doing. Tempest allows you to deal a bunch of thunder or lightning damage through various means. At 8th level they can add it directly. At 1st level they can use their reaction to hit people with thunder damage when they get hit. A War domain cleric gets the ability to make weapon attacks with their bonus action. However, it's worth a mention that the 8th level ability for these almost always adds the ability to deal some amount of extra damage with your attacks. typically in the form of 1d8 of whatever kind of relevant damage that domain would be doing. Or for the more caster-oriented domains, it will simply add your wisdom modifier to the damage of your cantrips, whereas the level 1 and 6th level class features for each domain tend to be a little more specific. Though more often than not, honestly, just the name of the domain pretty much sums up what they're going to be good at. For instance, life domain clerics make very good healers. Light domain clerics actually make very good spellcasters, as they get access to a lot more offensive stuff like Fireball at level 5. Tempest and War do very good in melee combat, as they get a lot of bonuses to those things. Trickery is great at giving you extra options for stealth, and because of all those choices and options you have here alongside the regular full spellcasting class that is the Cleric, all makes for a ton of options available to you, which again makes this class one of the most diverse in terms of play style. So when it comes to playing a Cleric, that's largely going to come down to you and the domain you have chosen. Though as a general rule, all Clerics are decent at healing and support spellcasting. This is because their base Cleric spell list that they will get regardless of how else you've built that character makes them good at those things. This includes things like buffing allies, healing them directly with healing spells, and in some cases simply debuffing the enemy. Clerics get a lot of those types of spells no matter what, and thus those roles are always available to you. From there though, it really comes down to the subclass you've chosen. For instance, if you pick up the light domain, you're going to be a pretty decent offensive spellcaster, so you might use that to supplement what you're already doing, to make you a more versatile spellcaster in general, while not trying to engage the front line too much, but rather hang back and simply heal and use spells where appropriate, whereas a Tempest Cleric or a War Cleric would very much so be up in the middle of things with heavy armor, martial weapons, doing as much damage as possible with any weapon you happen to have felt like giving them, which makes Clerics as a class very diverse in what they're able to do and how they choose to do specific things. But because of all of the various things they can get right at level 1 thanks to their domains, such as heavy armor and martial weapons right out of the gate with certain domains on top of any other benefits they get right at level 1, such as light domain using their reaction to impose disadvantage on people, or the Tempest Cleric's ability to do some damage as a reaction as well, makes them a relatively popular multi-classing choice. And while the roleplay of multi-classing a Cleric might be a little awkward as they ultimately serve gods, there are nonetheless a few popular options. Fighter, of course, being at the top of the list for their action surge and their fighting style they can pick right at level 1, being nice additions, especially if you want to go with a more martially focused Cleric, which is a similar case for Rangers who also use Wisdom as a stat, which makes for a nice overlap there as well. And another popular choice here is Paladin. Besides being of all of them probably the most thematically correct way to go, a couple levels of Paladin can get you access to things like Divine Smite, which a Cleric will have even more spell slots to make use of, and if you're already using something like the Tempest or War domains, that can be an especially good one. Though you wouldn't want to overlap that one too much, as Paladins work off Charisma and not Wisdom. Though things like Divine Smite, you don't necessarily need the Charisma for. Though, as you can probably tell from the length of this video compared to many of the other class overviews we've done, Clerics have a lot going on, both in terms of their class fantasy and the diversity of their roles in combat. Because whether it is a character on the front lines of a battlefield in service to the god of war, or a healer stitching together the wounds of the injured to make sure that they see the hope of a new dawn, all the way to the more sinister plots of a Cleric who has set out to sow death and destruction in the name of an evil deity, all of which would be valid options that the Cleric class can provide a unique experience for. So with all of that in mind, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something and found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But more than anything, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.